He arrived at 6:45 a.m. every morning, 15 minutes before the range opened. Never said much, just signed the clipboard with a slow, deliberate scrawl, last name only. The younger guys thought he was just another retired trucker burning through ammo until they watched his groupings. Perfect. Every single time. His shooting stance was old school, his grip was textbook, but something about the way he moved told a different story. Until that morning when a SEAL recruit bent down to pick up his brass and caught a glimpse of the tattoo on the old man's forearm. And suddenly, everything made sense. Welcome to Veteran Stories. Before we dive into this powerful tale of hidden legends, silent mastery, and the moment when the past finally catches up, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. Some heroes never stop being heroes. They just practice in silence. Precision Shooting Range in Virginia Beach opened its doors at 7 a.m. sharp, but Walt Harrison was always there by 6:45. At 73 years old, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned that rushing got people killed, but there was nothing frail about his movements. The range staff knew him simply as Walt. He'd sign the logbook with his last name in block letters, pay for exactly 1 hour of range time, and head straight to Lane 7. Always Lane 7, farthest from the entrance, away from the chatter and showing off. Walt carried everything he needed in a worn leather bag, one Springfield 1911, 2 magazines, exactly 30 rounds of .45 ACP, and a thermos of black coffee that never left his shooting bench. No fancy cases, no arsenal of weapons, no tactical gear covered in Malin lob patches. He wore the same thing every time. Faded Levi's that had seen decades of wear, scuffed work boots, and a brown baseball cap that had once been navy blue. His flannel shirts were always rolled to the elbows, sleeves pushed up with military precision. The younger shooters, and there were always younger shooters at Precision Range, would glance over occasionally. Some smirked at the old-timer with his ancient pistol and careful movements. Most ignored him entirely, too focused on their own training to pay attention to the quiet man who shot like a metronome. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Walt arrived at 6:45, signed in with his usual scrawl, and made his way to Lane 7. The range was busier than normal. A group of Navy personnel were conducting training exercises, their instructor barking commands and corrections. Among them was Petty Officer Second Class Jake Morrison, a SEAL candidate midway through his training pipeline. Jake was good, better than most, but he was struggling with precision under pressure. His groupings were acceptable for combat, but not tight enough for the standards his instructors demanded. Walt set up his target at 25 yards, farther than most recreational shooters attempted with a pistol. He loaded his first magazine with the same methodical precision he had used for 5 decades, chambered around, and assumed his stance. The first shot cracked through the morning air, then another and another. Walt's rhythm was hypnotic. Fire, recover, acquire target, fire again. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just the steady drumbeat of controlled violence. Jake couldn't help but notice. Between his own strings of fire, he'd glance over at Lane 7. The old man's target was developing a pattern that defied explanation, every shot within the X-ring, most touching the others. At 25 yards, with iron sights, using what looked like a pistol older than Jake himself. "Holy shit," Jake whispered to his training partner Mike Chen. "You seeing this?" Mike followed Jake's gaze to Lane 7, where Walt was calmly reloading his second magazine. The target downrange looked like it had been hit by a single very large bullet, every shot overlapping in the center mass. "Lucky grouping," Mike shrugged, but his voice lacked conviction. Walt finished his second magazine with the same mechanical precision, then his third. Each grouping identical to the last, a ragged hole in the center of the target that spoke of decades of perfect practice. Their instructor, Master Chief Rodriguez, had noticed too. He'd served for 28 years and had seen every kind of shooter, natural talents, trained killers, weekend warriors, and everything in between. But what he was watching at Lane 7 was something different entirely. "Boys," Rodriguez said quietly to his students, "that's what perfect looks like." Walt finished his 30 rounds exactly on schedule, set his weapon down, and began cleaning it with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. He didn't acknowledge the attention he was drawing, didn't seem to notice or care that half the range had stopped to watch him shoot. Jake finished his own training session feeling frustrated with his performance. His groupings were good, but nowhere near the standard he'd just witnessed. As he packed up his gear, brass casings rolled around his feet, the detritus of hundreds of rounds fired in pursuit of perfection. He bent down to police his area, gathering the empty casings as was proper range etiquette. As he reached for a particularly stubborn piece of brass that had rolled toward lane 7, he found himself just a few feet from Walt, who was methodically wiping down his pistol. That's when Jake saw it. Walt's sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and on his right forearm, faded but unmistakable, was a tattoo. Not the usual anchor or eagle that Jake had seen on countless sailors and Marines. This was different, specialized, deadly serious. A trident, a SEAL trident. But not just any SEAL trident. This one was older, simpler, from an era when such tattoos weren't common and definitely weren't casual. Surrounding the trident were numbers and letters that made Jake's blood run cold. VN 68 to 72, and below that, so faded it was barely readable, Team 1. Jake's brass casing clattered to the floor, forgotten. "Sir," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the respect that his training had drilled into him. Walt looked up from his weapon, his eyes meeting Jake's for the first time. They were pale blue, weathered by decades of sun and wind, but sharp as laser sights. "Son, that ink on your arm, that's Team 1, isn't it?" Walt's hands never stopped moving, continuing to clean his pistol with practiced efficiency. But something in his posture shifted, not defensive exactly, but more alert. "Long time ago," Walt said simply. Jake swallowed hard. SEAL Team 1 had been the first of the SEAL teams, commissioned in 1962. If this man had served with Team 1 in Vietnam from 68 to 72, he wasn't just any SEAL. He was one of the originals, a founding father of Naval Special Warfare. "How many tours?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. "Enough." Walt finished cleaning his pistol and began reassembling it. "You're in the pipeline." "Yes, sir." "Second phase?" Walt nodded. He knew what that meant. Jake had survived Hell Week, made it through first phase, and was now in combat diving. The kid had already proven he belonged, but the hardest tests were still ahead. By now, Master Chief Rodriguez had approached, drawn by the unusual conversation happening at Lane 7. He caught the tail end of Jake's question and Walt's response, and his experienced eye immediately cataloged what he was seeing. The faded SEAL trident, the Vietnam service dates, the quiet confidence of a man who'd been tested in ways most people couldn't imagine. "Master Chief Rodriguez," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "These are my boys." Walt shook his hand with a grip that was still firm despite his age. "Walt Harrison." "Mr. Harrison, if you don't mind me asking, what was your rate?" "So 1, retired 73. Rodriguez did the math quickly. Sonar technician first class, one of the ratings that became SEAL when the teams were formed. And if Walt had retired in 73 as an SO1, he'd been in the teams from almost the very beginning. "Jesus," Rodriguez whispered, "you were there when it all started." "We were all just figuring it out as we went," Walt said. "A lot of good men didn't make it home." The weight of that statement settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Jake looked at this quiet old man with new eyes, seeing past the faded clothes and careful movements to the warrior beneath. "What was it like?" Mike asked, then immediately looked embarrassed for asking such a broad question. Walt considered the question while he packed his gear. Different war, different enemy, different rules. But the job was the same. Get in, do what needs doing, get out. Bring everybody home if you can. "Did you?" Jake started, then stopped himself. "Did I what? Did you ever work with other teams, the ones that don't get talked about?" Walt's smile was barely perceptible. "Son, in those days, none of us got talked about. That was the point." Rodriguez understood what Jake was really asking. In the Vietnam era, SEAL operations were often coordinated with CIA operatives, special forces units, and other elements that remained classified decades later. Let's just say, Walt continued, we did our job, and we did it as quietly as possible. Rodriguez made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Mr. Harrison, would you mind showing these boys how it's really done? They're struggling with precision under pressure. Walt looked at the three younger men, Jake, Mike, and Rodriguez himself, all competent shooters, all dedicated warriors, all trying to master skills that Walt had been perfecting since before they were born. I'm not an instructor, Walt said. No, sir, but you're something better. You're proof that it can be done. Walt considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. Set up fresh targets. 50 yards this time. Jake's eyes widened. 50 yards was extreme range for pistol work, especially with iron sights. Most SEAL training focused on combat ranges, 7 to 25 yards where most engagements actually took place. Walt loaded a fresh magazine, chambered a round, and assumed his stance. But this time, he narrated what he was doing. Shooting isn't about the gun, he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd taught these lessons before. It's about control. Control of your breathing, your heartbeat, your mind. For the next 30 minutes, Walt Harrison gave an impromptu masterclass in precision shooting. He demonstrated techniques that weren't in any manual, explained concepts that could only come from decades of real-world application. In combat, you don't get to take your time, he said, firing a perfect group at 50 yards while talking. But you always have time to do it right. Fast is fine, but accurate is final. He showed them how to use their heartbeat as a timer, how to fire between beats for maximum stability. He demonstrated breathing techniques that allowed for precise shots even after physical exertion. Most importantly, he taught them about mental discipline. The shot starts in your mind, Walt explained. By the time you press the trigger, it should already be over. You should know exactly where that bullet is going. Jake tried to implement Walt's teachings, and his groupings immediately tightened. Not to Walt's level, that would take decades, but noticeably better than his baseline. How long did it take you to shoot like that? Mike asked during a reload break. Still working on it, Walt replied, and he wasn't joking. As the impromptu lesson wound down, Rodriguez found himself in the unusual position of having learned something new after nearly 3 decades in the Navy. This old man had just shown him techniques and concepts that weren't part of any current training curriculum. Mr. Harrison, Rodriguez said, have you ever considered coming to the base? My boys could learn a lot from you. Walt shook his head. I'm retired, Master Chief. Have been for 50 years. With respect, sir, men like you don't retire. You just change your area of operations. Jake looked between the two older men, sensing an undercurrent of communication that he wasn't quite following, but he understood enough to know that he was in the presence of something special, a living piece of SEAL history. Sir, Jake said to Walt, can I ask you something? Shoot. What advice would you give someone just starting out, someone who wants to be the kind of SEAL you were? Walt was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. Don't try to be the kind of SEAL I was, he said finally. Try to be the kind of SEAL your teammates need you to be. The brotherhood isn't about individual glory, it's about the man next to you making it home to his family. Rodriguez exchanged contact information with Walt, hoping to convince him to share his knowledge with future SEAL candidates. Walt was non-committal, but didn't refuse outright. A small victory. As they packed their gear, Jake found himself thinking about the encounter. Here was a man who'd helped create the foundation of everything Jake was working to become, and he'd been shooting at the same range for who knows how long without anyone knowing his story. Mr. Harrison, Jake said as they prepared to leave, thank you for the lesson and for everything you did before. Walt nodded once. Just do your job, son. Do it well and bring your people home. That's all any of us can ask for. Jake watched as Walt loaded his gear into an old Ford pickup truck and drove away. He tried to imagine this quiet, unassuming man as a young warrior in the jungles of Vietnam, conducting operations that would remain classified forever. That afternoon, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. He found himself looking up SEAL Team 1's history, trying to learn more about the unit Walt had served with. The information was sparse. Much of the early SEAL operations remained classified, but what he found was impressive. SEAL Team 1 had been commissioned on January 1st, 1962, at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado. They were one of the first two SEAL teams created to conduct unconventional warfare in maritime and riverine environments. Their early operations in Vietnam had helped establish the tactics and techniques that all future SEALs would learn. Walt Harrison had been there at the beginning, helping to write the playbook that Jake was now studying. Rodriguez, meanwhile, was having his own thoughts about the encounter. In nearly 3 decades of military service, he'd met plenty of heroes, legends, and warriors. But there was something different about Walt, a quiet competence that spoke of experiences beyond what most people could imagine. The next morning, Jake arrived at Precision Range early, hoping to see Walt again. Sure enough, at 6:45 a.m., the old Ford pickup pulled into the parking lot, and Walt made his way to the sign-in desk. This time, Jake approached him directly. "Mr. Harrison, mind if I shoot near you again? Yesterday was the best training I've had in months." Walt looked at him with those sharp blue eyes, considering. "Long as you don't expect me to talk through it, I come here for the quiet." "Yes, sir. Just want to watch and learn." Walt nodded, and Jake set up at lane 6, right next to Walt's usual lane 7. For the next hour, Jake observed everything Walt did. His setup routine, his shooting rhythm, his mental preparation for each shot. But more than technique, Jake was absorbing something else, the quiet professionalism of a man who'd spent a lifetime mastering his craft. Walt didn't shoot to impress anyone or prove anything. He shot because it was what he did, who he was, and had always been. Over the following weeks, Jake became a regular at the early morning sessions. He never asked Walt to teach him directly, but he learned by observation and occasional questions. Walt, for his part, seemed to appreciate having a serious student nearby, someone who understood the difference between shooting and marksmanship. Jake's performance in his SEAL training improved dramatically. His instructors noticed the change but didn't question it. In the SEAL pipeline, students were expected to find ways to improve on their own time. One morning, Walt surprised Jake by offering direct advice. "You're pulling left on your long shots," Walt observed without looking up from his own target. "Anticipating recoil. Fire through the shot, don't try to control it." Jake adjusted his technique and immediately saw improvement. "How did you know that without watching me shoot?" "Sound. Your shots have been getting progressively more inconsistent at distance. Usually means anticipation problems." Jake was amazed by the level of detail Walt could pick up just from listening to his shooting rhythm. Word began to spread quietly through the local military community about the old man at Precision Range, not through gossip or bragging, but through the subtle network of professionals recognizing expertise when they saw it. Other instructors started showing up for the early morning sessions, not to bother Walt, but to observe. A few Vietnam veterans who'd heard rumors came by to pay their respects to one of the originals. Walt didn't encourage the attention, but he didn't discourage it either. He understood that for some of these men, seeing a piece of their history still active and capable meant something important. One morning, a particularly grizzled Vietnam veteran approached Walt after his shooting session. "You probably don't remember me," the man said, "but we worked together in the Delta, 1971, Operation Phoenix." Walt studied the man's face for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Martinez, you were with SOG. Jesus, you do remember. Hard to forget someone who saved your ass in a firefight." The two old warriors shook hands, and Jake watched a moment of recognition pass between them, the acknowledgement of shared experiences that could never be fully explained to anyone who wasn't there. Months later, Jake successfully completed his SEAL training and received his trident. The first thing he did after the ceremony was drive to Precision Range, hoping to share the news with Walt. He found the old man at his usual lane 7, methodically working through his daily routine. Jake waited until Walt finished his session before approaching. "Mr. Harrison, I wanted to thank you. I got my trident last week." Walt looked at him with those sharp eyes, and Jake saw something that might have been pride. "Congratulations, son. You earned it." I couldn't have done it without what you taught me. I didn't teach you anything you didn't already have inside you. I just helped you find it." Jake extended his hand, and Walt shook it with the firm grip of a man passing something important to the next generation. "What's your first assignment?" Walt asked. "SEAL Team 5, deploying to Afghanistan in 6 months." Walt nodded. "Remember what I told you. Do your job, do it well, and bring your people home." "Yes, sir." As Jake prepared to leave, Walt called out to him one last time. "Son?" "Yes, sir." "The Brotherhood doesn't end when you retire. It just gets quieter." Walt Harrison continued his morning routine at Precision Range for years after that encounter. He never sought recognition, never told war stories, never asked for thanks. But word continued to spread through the military community about the quiet old man who shot like a machine and carried the history of Naval Special Warfare in his weathered hands. Jake kept in touch, sending postcards from deployments and occasionally stopping by the range when he was stateside. He learned that Walt had been doing this for decades, quietly mentoring young warriors, passing on hard-earned wisdom, ensuring that the lessons learned in blood weren't forgotten. Some heroes write memoirs, some give speeches, some appear on talk shows and receive medals in public ceremonies, and some show up at shooting ranges at 6:45 a.m., teaching the next generation through example rather than words, ensuring that excellence never dies. It just gets passed down, one perfect shot at a time. Have you ever met someone like Walt Harrison? Someone whose quiet competence spoke louder than any boast, whose skills were earned through decades of dedicated practice, whose service to their country continued long after their official retirement? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the quiet professionals in your life, the ones who taught you through example rather than lecture. Because at Veteran Stories, we believe that the greatest teachers are often the ones who never claim to be teaching at all. They just show up, do the work, and let their actions speak for themselves. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the quiet heroes among us, the ones who shaped history without seeking credit, who continue to serve without wearing uniforms, who prove every day that true excellence is a lifelong pursuit.